Welcome to the podcast for 1776 Forward.
We're the grassroots movement that's crowdsourcing activism for the cause of philosophical liberalism.
Stand up.
Speak out. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our latest podcast for 1776 Forward. I'm joined by Joia and Adam tonight, and we are picking up for this week's session on where we left off on our last discussion, talking about the why and the how of what makes this new movement unique and why we felt it was necessary. And there was a question that came up in our discussion among the podcast hosts that sparked some interest on the part of both Joy and Adam to dive a little deeper, interest in myself too. I'm really looking forward to this discussion. But for those of you who will watch that last episode, you may recall I had posed the question to the rest of my fellow hosts, why it was that they felt that advocates of liberty were making less progress in the culture to advance our ideas and values relative to, say, the advocates of statism and collectivism. And when I posed that question to the group, Adam posited a very intriguing notion that it was because the morality of altruism, as he defined it, governed both sides of the political spectrum, the left and the right, and that they were essentially both working towards the same end. Or at least that was the outcome of our politics. And Joia seemed to take some pretty strong issue with some of Adam's answer there. So that is what brings us to today's session, which we are aptly naming the Altruism Grudge match, because we're going to have a little bit of a grudge match between Joia and Adam to tease out these questions of what do we mean by altruism, and is it really the driving force behind our political culture today. So with that, why don't I open up and let's pick up where we left off. Adam, do you want to maybe, I think it'd be helpful for those who might not have seen the last session for you to just kind of restate your answer to my question of why is it that advocates of liberty haven't made as much progress in the culture? And you may be on mute, Adam, so just make sure to unmute yourself.
All right, this works so much better when I'm unmuted. Thank you, Chris.
Technology, yeah.
Although I guess not everyone would agree. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Joia. So as I remember your question last time, it's not that different. It was, why does society seem to inevitably tend towards statism and authoritarianism, regardless of who's in power? This seems inexorable for the past century or more.
Yeah, that's the same thing, different phrasing. Yeah, we mean the same point.
And I suggested this was because of altruism, and we didn't get into it. We didn't define altruism. I take the definition of altruism from the philosopher who coined it in the 19th century, Comte, who said roughly that the moral purpose of a person's life is to serve others, to live for the benefit of others. And I contrast it with egoism. The moral purpose of our lives is to live for ourselves, that we are ends in ourselves as opposed to tools to benefit society or other people. And this gets related to the idea of sacrifice, which I know from our pre-show talk we're going to discuss a little more later. But sacrifice in Ayn Rand's terms being the idea that one should give up a lesser value. Let me start again. Give up a greater value in exchange for a lesser value.
Mm-hmm.
If we were giving up one value for another of equal or greater value. For instance, doing something for our children would not be a sacrifice. That would be a trade or an even exchange, or even if I trade my Amazon shares with Chris for his Facebook shares, if it's voluntary, we both think that we're benefiting,
Right.
one way or another.
A trade of
It could be one of us is mistaken, but that's another matter entirely.
right. In other words, a
And
trade of
but we can actually both benefit from such things, even if the prices go with us or against us, because one of us may want something that's a little more volatile, and one might want something that's maybe a little steadier, but with less upside. So anyway, but this is I'm hesitant even about starting the podcast off with this, because this is a really controversial idea. Most people treat altruism as a synonym for benevolence and goodness. So the idea that altruism might be wrong or even evil is quite foreign. Ayn Rand's point, well, she had a number of points which she phrases more eloquently than I ever could. And none of this is new to me. I'm channeling her, so sometimes I'll quote her directly, sometimes I'll paraphrase, and then I'll be doing the best I can, but I'll surely get some things wrong. But if we truly didn't have any sense of self, we wouldn't be able to survive in the world. We have to be egoistic, at least, so that we somehow manage to obtain food, clothing, and shelter. Nature doesn't provide us a living otherwise. So I'm going to just quote Rand now. She says, "The basic principle of altruism is that man has no right to exist for his own sake, that service to others is the only justification for his existence, and that self-sacrifice is his highest moral duty, virtue, and value." So she goes on, "Do not confuse it with kindness, goodwill, or respect for the rights of others. Those are not primaries, but consequences, which in fact altruism makes impossible." So I could go on, but I think that's enough of an introduction. And I know Joia has some criticisms to make, so I'd love to hear from her.
Well,
I'm sorry, Chris.
Yeah, thank you for that, Adam. And before I jump over to Joia, I just wanted to maybe go a little bit more in depth on your answer, because I think that's a great definition of the concept of altruism as you're using it. And also, as I noted at the intro, part of what sparked this conversation is the fact that that was your answer to this question of why has liberty made less progress in the culture, or why does the culture trend inexorably towards statism and authoritarianism, regardless of who's in power. So one question I had is, now that we kind of know what you mean by altruism, I think maybe part of the answer might even be contained in something you just said. But my question is, what is it that makes you look out at the culture and draw that conclusion that that's a commonality between both sides of the political spectrum? Is it simply what you just said earlier, that's just kind of like the unchallenged consensus or conventional wisdom of what morality, like, in other words, that morality is equated almost with altruism, and most people just don't even conceive of an alternative? Is that why you think that, or is there something else maybe that you're looking at, in the political or other cultural context that makes you conclude that why it's so universal across the political?
That is true. I mean, it's a tautology. It's universal because almost everyone accepts it. But I don't think I answered the question of why accepting altruism would lead to statism and authoritarianism.
Fair enough.
And it's, lots of things that are straightforward in our own minds aren't quite apparent unless we actually say them out loud. So if the moral ideal of each of our lives is the well-being of other people, which we could generalize and say the well-being of society, if it would be chaos if each person judged for himself what was best for society. So we institute governments among men. Now, Jefferson said we institute governments to protect our individual rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But another dominant philosophy is that government is instituted, in perhaps a unfortunate turn of phrase from the Constitution, to improve the general welfare. That means somehow to make everyone better off rather than allowing people to make themselves better off and thereby making everyone better off in the process. So, if we agree that the purpose of each person's life is to sacrifice for others, we need someone to say who is to benefit and how much and to what degree and what mechanisms ought to be in place. So we say, well, I ought to provide for other people's health care. Well, I'm not a doctor. I'm not prepared to do that. I wouldn't know where to start. But we can have this government. Government can do health care for everyone. I'm obligated to provide for everyone's retirement, but I'm, by myself, I couldn't do that. A government, in theory, could provide for people's retirement, for their income in their old age if they didn't provide for it themselves. So that, there are all these ideas. The government is looked at, like some all-knowing, all-powerful parent figure. It's a combination. It's a secular view, but it comes from religion. The idea that there is and ought to be someone to take care of us.
So maybe.
And go ahead.
No, sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Finish your thought.
So does this make sense to you? The way that altruism would lead to statism?
Yeah, I was actually.
I'm sorry, we didn't define statism. By statism, just to make it clear, I don't mean the existence of a state. I mean the existence of a state that controls all aspects of personal and economic existence.
Right.
A state that has a large role in society rather than a relatively small state that would restrict itself to protecting individual rights. I mean, I believe a state is absolutely essential for human well-being. I'm not any kind of an anarchist.
Well, and I think certainly by virtue of you being a podcast host for 1776 Forward, we make that point crystal clear in our manifesto even.
Good.
That we are certainly for a government that protects individual rights. So I don't think no one on this podcast would mistake that from you. And that's why I use the term statism, because I think as an ism, as an ideology per se, that exalts the state as kind of the entity of political concern and control. That's what we meant. But just to circle back, if I understood you correctly, then the link I think that you're making between this concept, let me know if I got it right, is you're basically saying because altruism is a tautology or, a universal, because it just is the default morality for most people, regardless whether it comes from religion or secular basis, that therefore that manifests then in people's behavior and beliefs about what they ought to do or should do vis-a-vis their fellow man. And then because most of them, whether consciously or unconsciously, subliminally, sense that they may not be in the position themselves to solve all of those problems, they then inevitably default to kicking that responsibility to the state to determine these questions of, well, who should be the beneficiary of these sacrifices.
Yeah, I think I used tautology in a confusing sense. I just as soon. I don't literally think that altruism is a tautology. I was trying to say something else. But the important point is that once people believe that living for others is the moral ideal, then they have to believe that doing the maximum possible for others is the moral ideal, and the state is that agent that can in fact do the maximum for others, and also is best place. I mean, if we don't allow individuals to judge what's best for themselves, we couldn't. We have no philosopher kings to do it. It would have to be some kind of state,
Right.
that would make that judgment for us, for good or for ill. In my view, mostly for ill, but that's another matter.
Well, and therein is the provocative nature of your answer to my question, right? Which is that actually, insofar as altruism is the primary, dominant, or even universal moral code, that should be questioned.
Well, there's an interesting dynamic. We see. I mean, our society has tilted left for 100 years or more, or tilted towards statism. But actually, worldwide, we see more of a balance. States tilt towards statism until they impoverish themselves, when they don't really have the goods to give, and then they tilt towards capitalism again. So Sweden did this. It became very socialistic, and then they realized it was untenable. They became more capitalistic. The United Kingdom did this until Thatcher reversed things. So, in a sense, it's the capitalists that create the riches. The socialists dispose of them, and once they're gone, they call on the capitalists to create the riches again. So that's, in some place, we see this in the Soviet Union too. It was on a downward spiral for 70 years. It finally collapsed, and then out of the ashes grew a variety of things. Some of the states more free, some of them less.
Mm-hmm. No, great, thank you.
So the point I wanted to make there is that even if you wanted to somehow make society best off for the poor are best off in the society that respects individual rights and that promotes egoism rather than altruism, because that society is so much richer. The poor in that society are better off than the rich in authoritarian societies.
No doubt. And that is certainly a topic for, I think that we could definitely go into in a different day, but
we might mostly agree. But let's hear from Joia if we can.
Yeah, I was just going to say thank you for that. That's a great exposition of your views. So with that, why don't we turn it over to Joia? And Joia, when Adam first raised this answer to my question last session, you had a strong reaction, which ultimately even monikered the grudge match that we're having now. So I'm sure it will be a very friendly grudge match, but nonetheless, you took issue with some of what Adam had to say. So without stealing your thunder, I'll just hand it over to you now that he's had a chance to explain himself. Do you still take issue? And if so, what specifically would you like to take issue with?
Well, I'm going to start out by saying that I'm going to be ruthless in the altruism grudge match. But definitely this is a cheerful disagreement. And I hope that's even something that we're modeling in this conversation, because it is part of our values, the marketplace of ideas, and the overarching concept that we all are better thinkers and better human beings when we can have disagreements and hash them out in what I like to call cheerful disagreement. And I really want to thank Adam for going into more detail and really explaining his position on this, because I find that I definitely do agree with certain points that Adam is making. And then I have disagreements as well. So I'm going to start my disagreements even by pointing out that I find it interesting that when objectivists or others who follow Ayn Rand start talking about altruism, they always have to start by making the point that by altruism, I don't mean kindness or benevolence, and to point out that they want to talk about what is Comte's philosophical definition. But that already is very interesting. The very fact that you would have to do that suggests to me that most people in the culture, when they're using the term altruism, they're using it to mean benevolence or kindness, that they're not Comteans or Comtites. I don't even know the name of what you call someone who follows Comte because I really don't see many of them in our culture. So already there, I have a hard time accepting that that really is a major driving animus in the culture. But what I really want to talk about is even this idea of altruism. So the way that I understand Ayn Rand's point, whenever I hear Ayn Rand talking about egoism versus altruism, I want to start by saying I love that she takes this to fundamentals. She asks this fundamental, what should a human being live for? Which is a great question. And honestly, it's the question that I'm asking myself all the time. People probably know that Huenica is my chosen name, and that's what it means. It means what for. It is the question that I love to ask more than anything. So I love that Ayn Rand is going to this fundamental level. But I already think there's something confusing in the way that she often presents this, because she describes it as a binary between egoism versus altruism. And then she'll define egoism as living for yourself versus altruism, which she'll talk about as living for others, and then specify as sacrificing for others. It's interesting to me that already when we're talking about egoism as living for others, I found that when you say that to non-objectivists, that already that can be confusing, because it sounds as though you're saying we don't really need other people, we don't really need community, we don't really need relationships. And Ayn Rand is not saying that, but it's already to me a problem that objectivists always sort of have to make that point, that by egoism, we're talking about benevolent relationships, we're talking about healthy relationships, that a proper way of living for others is living for yourself. So it already occurs to me that perhaps we could have a better framework or better terms for thinking about how do we actually achieve human flourishing, and what is the actual integration between what I like to call autonomy and community, between yourself and the relationships you have with others. So that's on the side of egoism. But then on the side of altruism, this is where, for me, the rubber really hits the road, and I have a really deep problem with this. And the problem is with Ayn Rand's definition of sacrifice. Because the way I see it, her definition of sacrifice is just wrong. Factually, empirically wrong. It's not the dictionary definition. It's not what anybody means by the term sacrifice, the way it has ever been used in the thousands of years of recorded history that we know about, when people were definitely even sacrificing more than perhaps they even sacrifice now. So just to clarify again, Ayn Rand's definition of sacrifice, the way she describes it in Atlas Shrugged, as Adam pointed out, is giving up a greater value for the sake of a lesser value. But that's just not what sacrifice means. Sacrifice is always giving up a great value. I don't think you can have a sacrifice if you're not giving up something that is important. It is voluntarily giving up a value. But when most people use that term, I think there's often even uncertainty sometimes between what would be the end of giving up your value. But oftentimes when people talk about sacrificing, they're talking about giving up a great value for the sake of even a greater value. So even let's just think about some examples. So let's say the religious example of Abraham, who was asked to sacrifice his son Isaac. And if you read that story, I'll say as an English major, as a literary person, it's a beautiful story. The story goes into detail of how long Abraham had waited to have his son Isaac, how important Isaac was to him. Isaac meant more to him than anything on earth. And then God asks him to sacrifice Isaac. But the whole point of the story is that Abraham values God more than Isaac. Now, of course, you can certainly disagree with whether or not that should be the correct value. I'm sure as an atheist, you might point out that you ought to value Isaac more than a notion of a God. But certainly for Abraham, in his context, given his value context, God was the greater value over Isaac. And I think we see this even in modern day uses of the way people use sacrifice. For example, I hear lots of people say, even now, that they make sacrifices for their family. But when they say that, what I hear is they are giving up things that are valuable, but it's because the family is even more valuable. So I would say my parents, I think, would have proudly told you that they made sacrifices for myself and my sister. And they certainly gave up their time to run us around to all of our activities. They put in extra hours at work so that they could have the money to, and then they spent that money not on themselves, but to let us take piano lessons and dance lessons and theater lessons and go to Disney World. They were making sacrifices and that they were giving up something that was of great value, but it was certainly for something that was of even greater value to them, which was their family. Or even think about examples like when we hear that soldiers make the ultimate sacrifice. There is still this idea that they're giving up their lives, which is, of course, a great value to give up, but there is a sense that they are doing it for a greater value. And of course, again, you could always argue, like, is what they're giving up their life for a greater value? But my sense is that when people use the word sacrifice and think about sacrifice as a virtue, that it is giving up something great, but for the sake of something greater. And so I think there's already something problematic in Ayn Rand's whole approach to this issue, precisely because I think her definition of sacrifice in this way is just factually, empirically wrong. And I think we could use better, more accurate terms. And I hope that's even something that we do as part of this project, is maybe to think about what would be better terms besides egoism and altruism. So I've already perhaps put forward the idea of talking about autonomy and community, but to me, that's even just a start. I think we could even do a better job to think about how we actually talk about these issues. What is the best way for individuals to integrate with groups and society in a way that maximizes human flourishing? And I just want to add one last point to this conversation, that I think it's important to mention that Ayn Rand developed her ideas based on her experience as someone who left and lived through the horrors of Soviet Russia. She lived through the propaganda of people should sacrifice themselves for the sake of the state. And there, I think people who were making that argument, the people who were perhaps making that argument in good faith and not just the opportunists out to grab power, perhaps did have the conception that society, the whole, the state was greater than the individual. And I think we should be making an argument against that idea. I think that idea is wrong, that we shouldn't have self-immolation for the sake of the state. That's already a term that I think is maybe a better one that we could start using, that if what a certain side, our opponents, let's say, are advocating is self-immolation, that is never a good idea. But I'm open to even saying, what are better terms for thinking about how we properly integrate our own interests with wider interests. And one last point I just want to make to just connect this then to the conversation about what really are the cultural drivers. I think it's very interesting that currently in the 21st century, more people, I would say, actually do have, at least implicitly, a good, better sense of integrating, let's say, the personal with the social. My own background and observation in this is being a coach. So I've studied life coaching, and recently I've gone on and got a certification in travel coaching, and I'm now doing a really in-depth program in coaching flow. But through all this training, I've really been diving deep into studying the growth of what you could call the personal growth industry or the self-development industry. And interestingly, even since Ayn Rand has passed away in the early 80s, this industry has risen tremendously. Coaching has become perhaps one of the biggest growth industries right now in the 2020s. And people, I think, do have a good sense that personal growth is good, self development is good, that focusing on your well being in the long term is good. I find it fascinating that people within this community even start to know the Aristotelian term eudaimonia. And I hope even more people are going to start talking about the philosophy of eudaimonia and human flourishing. I see that as a really positive trend in the culture. I don't think the average person in America in 2020 is going to believe in any sort of way that we should have self immolation for the sake of the state. But my sense is that perhaps the average person does have confusion about how to integrate the value of community and society with their own individual goals and needs. And I'll just end by saying that I'm hoping that this is a conversation that we can further with this, our 1776 Forward project.
Well, thank you for that, Joia. That was an equally fascinating and just illuminating deep dive into your views on the subject, and it actually helped me kind of better understand. Well, even with our manifesto, in writing it, and as we've said in some of these podcasts, we're very definitionally oriented. So I think it's been extremely helpful to hear both of your definitions on this topic. Several questions jump out at me listening to what you had to say, and I certainly don't want to steal all the time for Adam to respond as well. But I guess one, I'll ask two quick questions, one clarification and one, kind of explanation, if you will. The clarification is, it sounds like am I correct in understanding that your primary disagreement is Ayn Rand's use of the word sacrifice, because conceptually what she defines it as is different from how most people define it as, and therefore that creates conceptual confusion? Or is it deeper than that, and you actually are taking issue with her conceptual, whatever she calls it, whether sacrifice or self-immolation or something else, that you take issue with that concept as such and think that it's not a real phenomenon?
Thank you for asking. That's a great question. So I would say definitely the former, that by having what I think is factually, empirically a wrong definition of sacrifice, it just adds conceptual confusion to our discussions and to our thinking. One of the bad effects, I think, is that it makes it easier to castigate people or criticize people unnecessarily, perhaps. I would say, from a positive perspective, I think the majority of people, I would say, are better intentioned. The majority of people, I would say, have some sense that they need to integrate both the value of their individual life and the value of society. And so having these, what I would consider wrong definitions, just adds unnecessary conflict and friction into our thinking and into our conversations and into our ability to work together and actually build a better society. So I think just it's always better to have conceptual clarity to actually make sure we're going out to achieve what we want to achieve. And then, can you just rephrase what the second point that you had was?
Well, I didn't actually ask that question yet, but what triggered it, frankly, was actually your use of the example of the soldier, right? Because I think Ayn Rand herself was very clear in kind of delineating the phenomenon of what the soldier is doing from kind of sacrifice as she defines it, right? She noted that in the soldier's case, probably because it, properly defined, meaning a soldier of a free nation like the United States, that they were fighting for a noble cause. She saw that as kind of a different moral realm, that action, rather than self-immolation, if you will, right? So it's clear that because she was able to draw that distinction, as you did, that the soldier was in fact giving up his life for what he saw as an even higher value, and one which she thought was actually properly a higher value, that she obviously saw this distinction, right? And so it just makes me wonder if perhaps this is more a debate over semantics rather than substance in her conception here.
Perhaps, but I would argue that the semantics do matter, because I think we want to make a distinction between what the soldier is doing versus the self-immolators, if we're going to call them that having that distinction is useful. And that
Sure.
as I said, it just adds, I would say, unnecessary friction, conflict, and argument. Because I think people do have a sense that sacrifice can be a good term. So when you come out of the gate and say sacrifice is bad, it's wrong, and then you just have what I think Ayn Rand has, this factually wrong definition, it just adds unnecessary disagreement and conflict, and it's not helping us actually understand reality and build a better society.
Fair point, and well taken. So then my second question, more explanation or letting you expound a little more, is kind of picking up on that. You then, I think, made the next step in kind of your chain of ideas in saying, because sacrifice, as most people use it and conceive of it, can be a good thing, and that you think that's how most people do use it and see the concept and, self-conceive of what it is they're doing in their own moral actions, that you didn't think that I guess that's the crux of your disagreement with Adam, that you didn't therefore think that the altruism as he was using it, kind of the Ayn Rand self-immolation definition, that really was what was driving most people on both sides of the spectrum. So I guess my question would be, perhaps then, if you hold that view, I mean, without totally, taking the conversation in another direction, well, then what? Clearly, we continue to move in a statist direction culturally. So if you don't think that's what's underlying people's morality, but we know politics is ultimately shaped by morality, do you see no kind of connection to the concept that Adam was introducing here of some kind of universal wrong moral premise that is shared by many in the culture?
Well, I guess I would say that I don't thus see any kind of universal wrong moral premise, but I'm going to have an unsatisfactory answer, which is to say I don't have a good answer for what is the driving force so I would agree with Adam's point that we definitely see increasing statism on both the left and the right for over now the past 100 years since the progressive movement of the early 1900s. So this is a question then, what does drive that? And I would say I don't have yet what I would think would be a good answer to that, but just that I don't see it as being this concept of altruism.
Fair
But
enough.
I want to hear more from Adam.
Yeah, I was going to say, I'm about to turn it over to him, but it sounds like then um, you would not boil it down to kind of that essential moral issue as kind of Adam put forward. Got it. And Adam, now that you both have had a chance to really kind of make your cases, what say you? Do you have a grudge on Joya's grudge?
Well, first, I'm going to get on board with Joya's endorsement of coaching in an unusual way. We don't have a sponsor for our podcast, but I want to give a free plug to the by far most enjoyable TV show I saw last year. It's I'm not a sports fan, but it was about a sports coach. It's on Apple TV. It's called Ted Lasso, and I recommend everyone give it a watch. It was there's one season available. It was popular enough. It's been renewed for 2 more, and I can't say anything that would do it justice. Just watch and get back to me. Regarding the issue of definitions, I don't think it's interesting to argue about definitions. I think we should argue about concepts. We can try and change names for things and come up with names for things. The issue I wanted to address was whether we should live for ourselves or live for others. I think politicians regularly do call for sacrifice, and what they mean is, in fact, making one's own self less well off for the benefit of some abstraction, some group of society, somehow, some part of society as a whole that doesn't necessarily include me because I'm being asked to make myself worse off. The most quotable example of this was President Kennedy when he asked us, do not ask what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And FDR and Reagan and most other presidents have done the same thing. I can remember President Carter asked us to turn our thermostats down. Other presidents have asked us to use less water, although they never explained to me what using less water what benefit that would possibly have to anyone. But sometimes just the idea of sacrifice, we're now asked to never mind, I was going to give an example that would cloud more than it clarifies. So I did not remember, Joia, that your taken name means what for, but that's exactly the question Ayn Rand asks about what she calls altruism. If we are to live for the sake of others, why? I mean, it's not difficult to conceptualize that we are ends in ourselves. The idea that we ought to live for others, while almost universally held, is not at all obvious. It's universally held because it's inculcated in us from childhood. For the past few thousand years, from religion, mostly Christianity, but now it's secularized. And the communists were atheists, but they still, wanted us to live. Well, they wanted the people unfortunate to live under their regimes, to live, for the sake of the proletariat, for the sake of the community, for the sake of the state, for the sake of Mother Russia, or for China and Mao, or the party, or some abstraction that always ended up making their lives worse. I wasn't sure if you were criticizing Rand for having grown up in communism and under communism and using that. I mean, I would say, having lived under communism and capitalism, that gave Rand much greater insight into the value of capitalism and the value of freedom. And in fact, she lived under the Tsar before she lived under the communists and the Kerensky regime. So she had relative freedom there, and she contrasted it with the much lesser freedom under Lenin, and then the much greater freedom, but still not absolute freedom, she enjoyed in the United States. So I also have to note that some countries and religions do, in fact, espouse this ultimate sacrifice. That's not the term you use. Self-immolation. The 21 9/11 hijackers were fully practicing this philosophy. They had nothing to gain for themselves, but they were gaining for their God, gaining for their religion, gaining for some abstraction. But clearly they were sacrificing themselves. And it's a pernicious and harmful ideology, and I have no problem calling it evil. And I think we have to get past terminology and talk about actual philosophies. And I think most Americans would have trouble agreeing that they should live for themselves and those they value, their loved ones, and that the individual is and ought to be the primary beneficiary of his own efforts. And not just most Americans, but most people worldwide. And this is in contrast to the philosophy of Aristotle and the Greeks, who looked at the world quite differently.
So it sounds like, Adam, that's a pretty clear statement that you are sticking to your position that altruism is, and some notion of
yeah. Now I agree. I agree with Joia that a lot of people don't really have a clear idea when they talk about altruism. They do mean goodwill and benevolence and kindness, and that's fine. But that's not actually what the term means, and we need a term. I don't think we are going to be successful in using this self-immolation term to replace it. So I think we just have to be clear. And that's why I tried to give a definition when I started, just to make sure that we were talking about the same thing and not simply arguing about definitions.
Sure. And, I think you have made clear, again, circling back here, a point that I observed, certainly, which is, even if we grant kind of Joia's position that many people may be confused on the topic or colloquially in their own lives don't mean altruism or sacrifice in the way that Ayn Rand did, I think you're right that almost without exception, the political leaders in our culture and not just in America, but around the world, are constantly using a much clearer notion of making yourself worse off for the sake of usually the state, or some other, group that the state has decided to elevate. That is definitely pretty universal. So perhaps Joia, maybe you want to add.
Let me just get one thing in here. I would never accuse a politician of being clear. I think they, for the most part, they take advantage of the dual meaning, and they like to say one thing and mean something unspecific, so that they can claim in one context it meant one thing, in one context it meant another thing. And this is something Ayn Rand called a package deal, and she criticized heavily.
Yeah, understood. But I think you still touch upon an important element, which is we all know politicians are duplicitous and package deal concepts for the sake of gaining power. But we as voters, especially in a relatively free system, democratic system like the United States, could certainly put an end to that if we wanted to. And this gets into...
we get the politicians we deserve, for sure.
Exactly.
Yes.
And so this gets into, I think, a real phenomenon that you have hit upon, which namely, and you said it earlier, even this kind of almost defaulting to politics, or the government as kind of the means for people to realize upon this aspect of altruistic morality? Maybe the answer is because insofar as this notion of making yourself worse off for the sake of others is inculcated in everyone, but that it is not practiced, as Joia is observing, in people's practical daily life, that they are kind of kicking by default, that they're kind of kind of giving off that moral duty to the state, almost, if you will. Maybe that's partly what's going on, but I want to turn it over to Joia to see if, based on what Adam has said, just some of the distinctions he's drawn, do you agree with that, or do you still think that the definitions matter for us to come to a proper understanding of this? Maybe perhaps if I might even think ahead for you, maybe perhaps some of this confusion from both the politicians and the people comes from this confusion about how to integrate autonomy and community in the context of a free society. But I'll let you answer.
Thank you. So I'm definitely going to agree with Adam that I would never accuse a politician of clarity. And unfortunately, I think confusion is what I would say the average American has about these questions of the value of the individual and the value of society. To put this in the most positive perspective, I would say most Americans have some sense that their own lives are important. When I was talking about how people value personal growth, the fact that that we can talk about our well-being, that's uncontroversial, I would say, in America in the 21st century. Even the concept of healthy boundaries is always an interesting one to me, because I find that even people on the left have very good ideas about healthy boundaries when it's about let's say avoiding toxic relationships with other individuals. But they never think about the healthy boundaries you need when it's the toxic relationship you have with the state. So, and I think that there is value to other people. There's value to your family, there's value to your friends, and there is real value to society. That we live in a trader capitalist system where other people are creating the goods that make life more abundant and wonderful. There is a real value to society. And I would say, even from an evolutionary perspective, so even if we're going back to sacrifice thousands of years ago, think about the examples when tribes would sacrifice 7 virgins to the volcano or something like that. And there was an idea that you were part of a tribe, and that tribe was going to, exist beyond yourself. But there'd even be sort of what our current understanding of genetics is, that we would have a drive to say, okay, my genes are going to survive on in my tribe, especially if my tribe really is just my extended family. And so there might be some value in giving up my own life if it means my genes and my tribe are going to go on. We certainly even see that in the animal kingdom, that many animals, the parent animals, will willingly sacrifice themselves and put their own lives in danger if it means that their children or their grandchildren will get to go on and further the gene pool. So I think my observation is, I think most people have some understanding that my own life is good, and relationships are good, and society is good. But ultimately, I would say there is confusion. And unfortunately, perhaps I would say the people who are most power hungry can often prey on that. They can prey on what is good about people's compassion and their thoughtfulness of other people in a way that ultimately is damaging to them as individuals, and ultimately even damaging to society as a whole, which is precisely why I would say I think we do need better terminology that will make clearer distinctions to help people figure out, how do I integrate the values of my own life with everyone else? How do I think about the healthy boundaries for myself and how that actually manifests in how I build relationships, both one-on-one with friends and family and with society as a whole?
Thank you, Joia. So is it fair to maybe rephrase, paraphrase quickly that sounds like you are saying that you think insofar as this phenomenon exists of kind of the trend, for statism, insofar as that is driven at all through this moral question of altruism, it sounds like you're coming down more on the side that that is born out of the conceptual confusion, at least Americans, we'll stick to the American context here, that Americans have on these dual values versus rather than necessarily a wholesale endorsement consciously of the philosophy of making themselves worse off for the sake of the state or some lesser value. Is that a fair way of summarizing?
Well, so here's the interesting thing. I think many people would believe that they should make themselves worse off for the sake of society, the state, and see the state as being a higher value. But I think part of what drives that is a kind of confusion, because even the people who would probably argue that and act for that in a certain sense would not be consistent with that. They would
Right.
certainly be egoists in terms of making sure they eat well and provide for their kids, and then at the same time be doing something that contradicts that. And so even that contradiction suggests to me that there is real confusion about how the average person thinks about integrating their life with the lives of other people. And hopefully this is where I think even liberty values are so beneficial, because we understand that society ought to be based on trader relationships and that society can be win-win relationships. I think a lot of people don't really even grasp that fact. I think a lot of people I talk about the creator trader network versus predator prey, and most people do not have that distinction. They don't realize that we don't have to be predators and prey. So that even starting to make some of these distinctions, I think, would help people grasp how they can be both acting for their own values and for wider society, and that these things do not have to contradict or come into conflict with each other. But I would just sum this up to say that I think using terms like altruism or sacrifice, especially with what I think is Ayn Rand's factually wrong definition, just confuses the issue even more. And it's making it so that people aren't even able to hear what they're saying, because they're hearing altruism and thinking about benevolence and kindness, and they're hearing sacrifice, and it doesn't mean giving up a greater value for a lesser value. So they can't even get beyond that oftentimes to perhaps hear what a good message could be.
No, thank you for that clarification. Yeah, because I was going to say, even in my own experience, I feel like I encounter many people of the persuasion that you note of, where they do see it as a good and argue for making themselves worse off for the state. Interestingly enough, I also happen to note how many of those people that I do encounter with that view practice that seeming contradiction, as you noted, versus their own personal life, which seems much more selfishly motivated versus kind of the politics they advocate. And personally, I probably come down more on the side of Adam's interpretation of what underlies that contradiction or motive. But you pose a very interesting alternative, which is that perhaps it's less having to do with perhaps not practicing consistently a conscious moral code that they hold, and more just more fundamental conceptual confusion.
Well, can I just jump in and say, I think that is precisely the problem. They don't have a consistent moral code. That if they had a consistent moral code, it would integrate, and it would be based on these ideas where we would recognize that there doesn't have to be conflict in human relationships, that pursuing your own individual values and pursuing what's good for society is and can be a harmonious whole, and that ought to be what your conscious morality is, but that certainly people don't have that. Yeah.
Right.
In that sense, Adam and I definitely would agree, I think.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that's a great plug even for our movement. And, you know, I think that is a key point that we try to emphasize. It's one of the 10 key themes we talked about in our manifesto, namely this this notion of the creator-trader proper ideal of society versus the predator-prey, because I think you're right. I think most people, for whatever reasons, do still start from a predator-prey premise or kind of metaphysical worldview, and from that confusion flows so many other ill effects. So maybe that in and of itself is somewhat of an answer to this question that I originally posed. I know we're basically at the end of our time, but Adam, you know, any last thoughts to what Joia just noted?
I just want to agree. I think one improvement I've seen in society over the years is people are more self-aware, more cognizant of boundaries. That's, I hadn't thought of putting it in those terms. I guess we are less self-aware in terms of politics. That is, you know, we formed into tribes, and we can't imagine that anyone who disagrees with us is anything other than evil or an idiot in political terms. But in personal terms, we're much better off psychologically. Even if we engage in things like codependency, we can recognize it and name it. It's the world's better in a lot of ways, and I'm happy about that.
Well,
Can I jump? Oh, can I jump in and say I want to agree with Adam? And I think that's exactly right. The very fact that mindfulness is a word that most people know nowadays, I see that as part of this trend of the rise of personal growth and self-development. And it is a way in which I agree that our culture is better. And I'll just point out, I think there is a real reason why people start with the predator-prey premise, which is that we are predators. That's part of what it is to be alive. As human beings, we have to be predators off of plants and animals in order to survive. And certainly, as societies have developed, that it was a legitimate, effective, short-term way to survive, to band with your tribe, and then to predate on the other tribe. And we see that happens with primates, and we see that happens in human tribes throughout history. And it really is, I think, a development to realize that we can go beyond predator prey in our relationships with other human beings. I think it was the Enlightenment thinkers who were the first to really start to grasp that we don't have to be predator preys with other human beings. And in fact, society works better for everyone when we get rid of the predator prey approach to dealing with human beings and approach other human beings as creators and traders. But history shows that it took thousands of years for the Enlightenment thinkers to start to realize that. And that, unfortunately, I don't think the majority of people ever really grasped it, because sadly, I think we are perhaps starting to lose it. So that's what makes this project, I think, so important,
Right.
to really clarify these ideas even more and help people recognize this possibility.
Yeah, no, thank you for that clarification. It kind of goes without saying, or I was assuming the benefit of yours and my many years of conversations where I think we kind of, articulated this concept and this alternative of the creator-trader model versus the predator-prey model. My whole point was just that, notwithstanding the very legitimate evolutionary and historical basis for the predator-prey model and human understanding of kind of our society, we have had the benefit of now of 500 years of post-Enlightenment development and progress. So you would hope or think that in 21st century America, less people would be still operating under that predator-prey premise, seeing the benefits of the alternative model all around us. But as you noted, perhaps in part because of the over 100-year trend now kind of backsliding away from that ideal, less and less people seem to grasp that distinction. So that is certainly one of our goals with 1776 forward, as are some of the other ones that Adam and you both noted. So this has been a great discussion. I guess in judging it, I would say you both are still somewhat in your corners, but you landed some good blows for your sides, and I think also managed to persuade the other to some of your positions. So all in all, I would say we definitely gained a much better understanding of this issue, and how we here at 1776 Forward are seeking to provide some of this moral and conceptual clarity, if we can, as you all out there who are listening and watching are thinking through these issues. So thank you, Joia and Adam, for your time, and we look forward to seeing everyone back on our next podcast session. That's it for now. Take care, everyone.
Chris, did you tell us the next one's going to be a rap battle?
That's going to be all you, Adam. You're going to do the rapping all by yourself.
Oh, good.
Unless we can do some Hamilton.
Guaranteed to lose.
We can do some Hamilton. I'll jump in.
Exactly. Well, thank you all. Bye for now.
Ciao.
Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to join in the conversation, you can become a member for free and join our 1776 Forward community on locals.com. See you there.